work, so hopefully we will somehow manage the whole story. Okay. Now we could start with webcasting. The initial question is, what are new institutional arrangements or new institutional solutions of public service delivery? The classical, the traditional way of providing and producing and delivering a certain service was very simple. Classical welfare state, you remember we discussed that a bit also in the last sessions. The assumption of the classical welfare state meant, well, we just set up certain governmental organizations, public administration units, and these units will deliver the services to the public. Usually in quite a monopolistic way. So we had monopolies, regional, local monopolies providing these services. That have been the times, well, maybe 20, 30 years ago, even longer, of course, in many states around the world. Classical system, just the public sector and the public sector organizations providing these services. Well, nowadays, times have changed. We have new, different, alternative arrangements. We find a quite pluralistic and differentiated, sorry, only one F, patterns of organizations in a variety of sectors, in the public, in the semi-public, and in the private commercial as well as the private non-for-profit sector. So it's a pretty broad choice for delivery or delivering options. And sometimes even more, if you look into reality, you will get some ideas, hopefully today. You will not find just one provider, you will rather find something like a network of different providers of services to the public collaborating together. Imagine examples like youth, child care, elderly care, health care. In many of these areas you will find numerous organizations delivering parts of a certain service. For instance, you will find a municipality, you will find some few for-profit organizations, you will find a number of non-for-profit organizations like religious or voluntary associations offering certain services. If you imagine certain examples in areas I have mentioned. So it is not just one organization, it's a network of different organizations. And of course that is also a challenge for, let's say, the government. Steering of networks is always something more difficult, at least something different compared with steering and monitoring just a single organization. And we already have entered this idea. In such a setting where the state is no more the only monopolistic producer and deliverer of a service, but more, let's say, the governance institution steering, coordinating and controlling, supervising all these different activities, that's a new role for the state, for the government, particularly for the executive part of the state. And we discover one of the, let's say, very fashionable, catchy words nowadays. Probably you have heard about that in some other lectures, governance. We are dealing with governance issues because there is a need to steer and to monitor different institutions and not only in a pure hierarchical way. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this picture gives you an idea of what the institutional choice is about. You see at least 4 different alternatives you can choose between. You can either select that a core governmental unit, let's say a part of a ministry or a part a core part of a municipality, something like that, is responsible for the service. Option number 2, if you go from left to right, there could be the choice to choose a more or less autonomous but still public organization. You will in a minute learn that we usually distinguish between two different alternatives. One is the so-called agency, question number 2. The other is the public enterprise or public utility, sometimes also called corporation, public corporation. So you have different variants under that umbrella of an autonomous, more or less autonomous public sector entity. Option number 3 is you can go much more towards the private sector. You can contract out the service and make a contract with a private company, private business firm to produce and to deliver such a service. Imagine in many cases in energy, in water, in waste disposal, in public transport, you will find private providers offering services, or telecommunication, for instance. It's nowadays very, very common. The fourth option of institutional choice, however, is interestingly not a for-profit running company. It's a non-for-profit organization, as you typically find more in the field of social services, caring services, cultural tasks, and similar areas. Services where the so-called non-for-profit organizations, the NPOs, sometimes also called NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are busy and doing their services. All of you know a lot of examples in different fields. Remember Red Cross, Caritas, Amnesty International, Greenpeace, you know, a lot of different examples. 10,000 usually in every country, in Italy as well as in other countries. Many, many 10,000 of such NPOs or NGOs are existing and offering their jobs to the public and delivering to some extent public goods, or you may say meritorial goods. So once again, you see the choice, the portfolio of choice is rather divergent. You can either go for a real classical public administration. You can choose a more autonomous but still public organization. You can go for the private sector, and you can go for the private commercial sector, and you can go for the private non-for-profit, let's say non-commercial or semi-commercial sector. That's the issue of the day. No? What is best? And I'm sure you will have already an answer. There is no best solution for everything. Defense is completely different from social care or education or health or maintaining highways or maintaining other physical infrastructure. It depends, of course. That will be the answer of the day. It depends on the task and on certain other circumstances, whether you choose one or the other of the described solutions. And that gives us the opportunity to introduce, at least shortly, a view on the role of the state. I apologize for, let's say, 5 minutes being a bit more, well, not philosophical, but doctrine-oriented, to give you the idea of different perceptions of the state in our society. I know that's probably a bit dry and heavy for business administration students, but I think 5 minutes should be just acceptable. The traditional concept and perception of the state was the producing state. You remember a few minutes ago I introduced to you I mentioned the welfare state idea, the concept that we in a welfare state try to produce and to deliver as much of the services to the public by own means, by own production capabilities and own institutions, public sector. So the traditional perception was the state has a more or less monopolist role to produce and deliver services. That has changed in the last couple of years, let's say from the producing state to a new, more actual, more currently really controversially debated perception of the state as the ensuring state. To ensure, if you are familiar with English, means to garant, to make sure, ensure, to make sure that a certain service is delivered. So the idea behind the ensuring state is, be ready, that's question number one of the three important questions of the day. The idea of the ensuring state is to give the state a new priority role. The state should decide on the tasks and services which are feasible and should be delivered or produced and delivered to the public, regardless whether the state with its own capabilities and institution is producing this type of services or other, you remember, private, non or for-profit institutions are producing and delivering the service. So it's a new concept. To ensure means just to garant, to garant a certain service to be delivered to the public. And you see, in this connection, we have some different roles of the state. The state is now not only or not primarily the producer of a service. The state is, for instance, the initiator, initiating a certain service delivered by, for instance, civic society or private means. It's a coordinator, sometimes financing a certain service and something like that. You see, so I don't want to go through all the details. The new roles of the state are pretty different from the classical role of the producing state. It's now more coordinating, guaranteeing and initiating function compared with former times. To explain this concept a bit more detail to you, because it's a rather actual, and in several countries like, for instance, my own home country, Germany, or Italy, and in numerous other Western European countries, heavily discussed concept of the ensuring state. You also see the German, if somebody of you is German, you will see that is a German word for ensuring state, Gewährleistungsstaat, which gives you maybe a certain smell of the understanding behind it. So you see in the next point the principles of this new perception of the state. The state is deciding on certain tasks and services. The state is granting a certain service. We come back to the contractor-provider split in a minute. Please be patient for some seconds. The state is also deciding on the institutional setting. You remember institutional choice. That is our issue of the day, and we already had some first slides on that topic. So the state is deciding, well, what is the appropriate institutional setting in which we will produce and provide a certain service. And the main question in that context is, of course, who should do the job? Who is producing and delivering a service? Who means which institution is appropriate for doing that? And connected with this granting or ensuring message, the state has to contract out or to tender a certain service. To tender means to describe a service in all details, quantity, quality, time, schedule, etc. Of the service, and to invite public and private providers to participate in such a tender and to hand in an offer that institutions are interested in producing and providing the service. You will see that in a minute, how it works. And that question, you remember, was the task of last week. Last Wednesday we discussed the make or buy decision. That's exactly the same topic we are today again discussing, but from another viewpoint. Today it's not the question make or buy from a, let's say, more economic or more strategic point. It's more the question of, well, which institution should do it? Public, private, or non-commercial institutions. And regardless who is doing the job, the state, of course, also has the responsibility to monitor and to supervise the whole production and delivery process. Are these public or private institutions delivering a certain service according to the tender, to the objectives? So that seems to be also an important task. So once again, you see these 4 different aspects. At first, the state is deciding on the tasks, which tasks should be provided to the public, which are important, which are less important. That's a pure political decision, of course, taken by parliament and government. Secondly, the state will have to decide on the institutional setting, will tender out a certain service, and will monitor the progress of delivery. And in this context, it is quite helpful, and I would like to invite you for a minute to think about that, to distinguish different variants of responsibilities. One important responsibility is the so-called granting or ensuring responsibility. The state, in this perception of the ensuring state, has the power and should have the responsibility to grant a certain service. That means, to take an example, let's say childcare. I take a very concrete example from my own country. Childcare means between the age of 1 year and 6 years, all parents should have the opportunity to get their children educated in a kindergarten, in a public or private kindergarten, according to certain quality standards, let's say group size, education and training of the teachers, etc. Also certain treatment, pedagogical and etc. treatment should be ready. All this should be granted, regardless whether the kindergarten are provided by public or private providers. It could be Caritas, it could be, if it's profitable, probably not, but if it's probably, it could be done by a private commercial company, or it could be done by, let's say, municipal public services. So you see, with that example, that gives you maybe some more ideas about the granting responsibility. Apart from the granting responsibility, there should be the providing responsibility. That's another responsibility. The institution producing and delivering the service should have the full providing responsibility. Take the example of childcare. If let's say, a certain non-profit organization, Caritas, Red Cross, is providing a kindergarten with 200 places for children, then this organization is fully responsible for the daily provision of the service, that children are nicely treated, well educated, they canteen is, or the meals are properly cooked, etc. All these important things. Additionally, there might be also the question of for instance, of a financing responsibility. Who is responsible to finance the whole story? Is it the state by tax money? Is it are the parents, and to which amount? The parents are probably, according to their income, are responsible to co-finance such a service, or what are the sources of financial, of incoming money, of revenues. So that's again another responsibility. Who is responsible for financing the whole job? You see in that small little diagram, unfortunately it is a bit difficult to demonstrate it with this bloody microphone here. You see the differentiation between the two different important forms of responsibility. The granting responsibility is the providing responsibility. And please think just a moment about these three different blocks of tasks. There might be certain tasks which are so important that we call them public core tasks. Remember last week, Wednesday, we had the same issue with high strategic relevance. In such a case, like public security issues, defense, something like that, you will probably agree that the state should not only have the granting responsibility, but also the providing responsibility. We don't, in most countries in Europe, we don't want private policemen. We would like policemen to be public because they are better controllable. So providing and granting responsibility should be with the state. However, there are numerous other tasks which are not so important, but they are of course politically relevant. We might call them public granting tasks. Just take the example of childcare. Childcare would be a wonderful example for such a granting task. The state should be responsible for granting, for ensuring that this service is delivered to the public, but the state is not or must not be responsible for providing the service. The providing responsibility is either with the public or the private provider who is offering that service. Thirdly, there are definitely a lot of tasks which may be called private core tasks, just regularly day-to-day tasks where the state has nothing to do. Well, it's not a job of the state to interfere, so therefore we might say it's pure private responsibility. Let the state keep out of that area. So the message I want to give you is there should be something like a typology of three different important tasks, and you can differentiate them if you look on the differentiation between granting and providing responsibilities. Okay. I have to return to that diagram, although it becomes a bit, I think I tried for a minute without the microphone, at least without this one. Please try to follow me a bit, also, even if it's a bit more difficult for you. The contractor-provider split is a concept you see on this diagram which tries to bring down to earth the idea of the insuring state. The basic idea of that split or of that diagram is that we distinguish between two different roles: the contractor on the one side, the provider on the other side. I think we have introduced that somehow appropriately in the last minutes. So just to make it a bit more concrete, the contractor is the top government of a city or of a region or of the whole state, whichever we are discussing. The contractor has the task of the political strategic planning, setting priorities. That's typical government job, or particularly parliamentary job. Has the task to supervise, to steer, to coordinate, etc. All these different tasks. So that is all the ensuring role of the state or of the government over there. On the other side, you have here, if you see that body, that block here, you have another part of government, and that is the providing part. For instance, an own administrative unit or an own public enterprise which delivers services to the citizens. Just take the example of a municipal kindergarten. That could be a kindergarten, you know, or a chain of several kindergartens in a city like Milan or like Berlin or whatever you think about. That is the provider side. And you don't have only a public provider, this block, you also have private providers. You remember we had the choice already, so you can give a certain order to an external public or private provider, for instance, to a non-profit organization. So the idea is, well, basically simple. The contractor is planning and tendering a certain service, for instance, childcare, and there will be either a service agreement with an own administrative unit, a municipal kindergarten, for instance, or there will be an external contract with an external provider, for instance, a private non-profit organization or a private for-profit company. And well, besides that, there might also be some political controlling, which I won't touch at the moment because I think it's not really, it's not as important. So the message is as follows. If we want to follow that perception of the ensuring state, it is necessary to make it more concrete. One very concrete organizational consequence is this so-called contractor-provider split. If you look into certain government organizations, for instance, in the Scandinavian countries or even in Italy, in local government in Italy, or in classical public management states like Australia or New Zealand or United Kingdom or the United States, you will very easily find this contractor-provider split. No? On the one side you have the contractor, clear distinction. On the other side you have the different public and or private providing institutions. I hope that is more or less clear to you. Well, having said that, I would like to introduce to you a small view on developments in our state and society in the last 10 years. If you look back, let's say the last 10 or 15 years, you will find, sorry, today I really have to move very often to the board. You will find an interesting tendency of more and more overlapping and more and new interfaces between these three major sectors of our society. If you realize just one, or let's say two examples. State and economy are more and more interlinked with each other. For instance, because we are more and more inviting private capital to collaborate with public organizations to provide certain services, so-called PPP, public-private partnership solutions. If you take the Milano case, the ATM, every bit of you will know that. That's a typical PPP. It's half private, half state. So it's just, it's just a, let's say, a mixed economy of public and private. You are not really sure. Is it still public? Is it already private? The borderlines are blurring and becoming more and more diffuse. Same is with, let's say, with state and civic society. I give you one example from my own town, from Berlin. 1 year ago, Berlin government decided to transfer nearly all kindergartens. You see, that's my favorite example here. But that doesn't mean that I feel in a kindergarten here. Sorry, don't want to say that. Nearly all kindergartens from the city, from the state, to private non-profit organizations. 80,000, imagine, it's quite a number, 80,000 different kindergarten places in some 300 different units of kindergartens have been transferred in the last 2 years from public to private, non-for-profit sector. And now, no more the state has the providing responsibility, instead the private non-for-profit organizations. Many hundreds of such non-profits are now responsible for delivering services to the parents and to the children. Caritas, sports associations, whatever, many, many different left or right-wing organizations are busy in that field. Having said that, I think, oops, it's always really difficult here, it is, I think it would make sense to see just 5 different important trends we have observed in the last couple of years. Trend number 1, left, where we go again from left to right, as usual, is autonomization. One trend we really can discover in nearly every state, or let's say industrial state of the world, is governments gave more autonomy to different single organizations. You will see some examples in a minute. Secondly, the second trend is contracting out. Governments decided to contract out more and more services from the government to private, usually for-profit providers. For instance, public transport, energy, telecommunication, etc. Trend number 3, PPP. I just mentioned it a minute before. Governments are more and more motivated and keen to set up such public-private partnerships. They collaborate with the private sector in many different fields, for instance, in financing infrastructure, highways, tunnels, railway systems, and such things. Trend number 4 is, and that will be one point of debate of our final discussion, hopefully, if we have some time left, privatization. That's not a very new trend, but it is still valid, very important. For instance, in Italy, the last 15 years, numerous public, or let's say state-owned companies have been sold to the private sector, to the private capital market, and are no more owned by the government. We will come back to that in some minutes. And number 5, that is maybe a not so common but also important trend, devolution of certain tasks to the civic society, particularly to the already mentioned non-for-profit sector. Take the example I just gave you from Berlin, the transfer of kindergartens from the public to the non-profit sector. Classical case of devolution from the state to the private non-for-profit sector. So you see there are different trends. All are related to our today's topic, institutional choice. There's much more institutional choice today compared with 20 years ago. Again, in this picture, I can make it pretty short. I only want to draw your attention on one point. It's a bit difficult to reach because it's very on the bottom here. Decreasing public influence. So if you go from left to right, if you walk down these steps, you may say, from autonomization via the different PPP variants to contracting out and finally to privatization. I left out the devolution story. As you see, there is a decreasing public influence. You have quite remarkable influence on your own but autonomous organizations. The more you are going from left to right, the more your influence on decision making of these institutions is decreasing. Not surprisingly, that's why you are doing that. You want to have more flexibility of these organizations. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's have at least some ideas about these different variants, these different institutional solutions. One is very broadly in the Anglo-Saxon world called agencyfication. That means establishing agencies or transforming a certain core governmental unit into a more independent organization, which is called agency. So you see, there is something like a definition of an agency, but we will come back to that also in one of the next slides. If you look around in the last 10-15 years in our OECD world, you will find a lot of examples. One is United Kingdom. During the Thatcher regime in the 80s, the so-called Next Step initiative was a very important program to introduce some hundreds, or let's say some 130 of such so-called executive agencies in UK, but similarly in many other countries. Another version or variant of autonomization is, or may be called, corporatization. Again, an interesting trend and an interesting tendency. Governments, primarily at the local level, but to some extent also on the state level, on the national level, have decided to transform parts of their governments into real enterprises, into real business corporations with an own legal status, with an own equity, and all the other important elements, with an own management board, elements of an own company. So a tendency which can be clearly seen, for instance, in Italy. If you look in this city, Milan or Roma or other large cities in Italy, you usually will find hundreds of corporations around the core government of a city. Roma, of course, is particularly, it's a very, very metropolitan area. It's particularly famous. Sometimes also a bit in trouble with this many, many hundreds of corporations being owned by the municipality. So you have something like, let's say, holding structures nowadays in many municipalities existing not only of the core government but of a bulk of, let's say, satellites, little or bigger, more or less autonomous organizations. Oops, what's now? I think I can go a bit quicker through that chart. I think it's not really important to see all details at the moment. You will find, if you read it more carefully at home, you will find some definitions or some elements of an agency. Remember again, question number 2 is dealing with an agency. So what is an agency? You find some elements around here. But that's not the same in every country. This is more, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon perception of an agency. If you look to the classical European states like Italy or Germany or France, it will be a bit different. I think it doesn't make sense to go through all details. This slide rather gives you a picture that agencies are, or as the OECD is calling it, arm's length management or government. Agencies are pretty familiar in many countries of the world. I mentioned already the UK case. You see some 130. Even in Spain, if you look into one of the countries which usually are not in the foreground of public management reforms, you will find quite a number of such, let's say, semi-autonomous entities. Sweden is an interesting case because in Sweden they have established the agency concept not now but about 200 years ago. So that is an interesting case. Swedish government is used since many, many decades to work with agencies. The number of ministries in Sweden is very, very small. Just a couple of ministries, only a few hundred ministerial civil servants. The rest is all in several hundreds of agencies. Even in France or in New Zealand, you will find examples of this case. German case is a bit particularly because we don't have the, let's say, the classical agency type at the moment, but there are a lot of so-called federal agencies which also play the role. Netherlands, again, you see some data, about 30% of all civil servants are working in such so-called ZBOs, independent administrative bodies. Canada, a last case. Okay, I think that should be enough on the agency or autonomization issue. PPP, another story I would like to touch with you. We have already discussed a bit. It is not really surprising and new for you that if you speak of PPP, there should be, of course, at least one public and one private partner, and the goals of the two partners should be somehow interrelated and compatible. Let me introduce shortly to you two different variants of PPPs. The first one, contractual PPPs, that is the most fashionable nowadays and also in the last few years. Many countries, again, United Kingdom, currently in my country, Germany, it's a big fashion to establish contractual PPPs. For instance, just to give you a few examples, for highway reconstruction, particularly in the eastern parts of Germany, or for constructing new railway systems, fast train railway systems from north to south with tunnels and new infrastructure. Typical system is to collaborate with private financing institutions, usually with large banks, and with private construction institutions to invest in and to implement such structures. So that's a very fashionable story. The second one, the so-called corporational or institutional PPPs, is not new. We know that since, I would say, since decades at least. In many countries we find a lot of public-private companies where you have shareholders on the public sector, but as well shareholders from the private sector. I mentioned a minute ago, or a few minutes ago, ATM in Milano. That's a typical case of an institutional or corporational PPP owned more or less 50-50% by public and private shareholders. I think, well, it is pretty self-explanatory why are public-private partnerships so fashionable. One of the important aspects is probably to exploit resources, to get private capital into the public sector, because public sector is running out of money. So that seems to be one of the important issues. Only one slide on PPP, because we really want to just to get an overview on all these different aspects. Let's now have a look on number 3 of our different options, contracting out. You remember contracting out is, or we can more or less synonymously say outsourcing is a concept where we are transferring a task or a part of a task or service to a private provider. Usually we mean private for-profit companies, but it may also be private non-for-profit. That should be based on a contract, an agreed upon written contract, signed contract with usually a limited duration. So contracting out means, for instance, giving a service to a private transport company for maybe 10 years. 10 years might be an appropriate time frame, not too long, but enough to depreciate the investments. Remember, that's the difference to the full privatization. The insuring responsibility stays still with the government. Remember, we differentiated between insuring and providing responsibility. The insuring responsibility still remains with the public sector. Number 4, finally. You see, we are proceeding a bit, and I think it's also necessary because we only have 25 more minutes. Privatization. It's a bit more time-consuming to speak about privatization. I'm sure all of you have at least some understanding of privatization. You have heard the term, and you will probably have some ideas what it is about. However, imagine there are quite different variants of privatization. The first variant, take notice, that's question number 3 of the day. The first version is formal privatization. What does this mean? Formal privatization is basically very simple. It is just transforming a government-owned organization in another legal status. I give you a clear example from my own country. Our German Federal Railways used to be a government-owned a part of the government, not just a part of the whole federal government. It was one unit, a very large unit with hundreds of thousands of civil servants, etc., like Trenitalia or SNCF in France or whatever, just a typical part of the government. About 10 years ago, government decided to formally privatize the German Federal Railways. That meant to transform this government organization into a private sector. Please be aware of every word now. The private sector oriented type of legal status. More precisely, into a joint stock company. Nowadays it is Deutsche Bahn Aktiengesellschaft, that means German Railways joint stock company. It is still so far 100% state-owned. No private shareholder so far. It's a very big debate at the moment in Germany whether it should be fully privatized. Fully means the shares should be sold to the private sector. But so far it is only a change, you may say a change in the naming, from a government entity into a slightly more autonomous private commercial law or private commercial law based company. Still no change in ownership. Still government is 100% owner. If you look around in the world, you will find millions of examples like that in many, many countries. I'm sure also in Italy. Unfortunately, I don't have so many examples from this country, but should be quite prominent. Another frequently used option, for instance, that was the case in Italy during the Berlusconi regime, but also in former times, sale of government assets, infrastructure, or private commercial companies. Just imagine one big issue is still in Italy, Alitalia. It is still, at least to some extent, government owned as far as I know, and it's a big issue to sell it for a proper price to private provider, to private shareholders. So privatization of assets or of property is another important issue. If you look to all these transformation states in Eastern Europe, for instance, Poland or Hungary or Czech Republic or whatever, you will imagine there was a big sale out of formerly government-owned assets to the private sector, because former times everything was state-owned, and nowadays we have capitalism and more private rules of the game. Number three, a third variant may be called functional privatization. That is exactly the same what we covered some few minutes ago with contracting out. So remember, probably two conditions. Functional privatization is if the service is going to a private provider only for a restricted period, for instance 1 month, 10 years or whatever. Second criteria, the ensuring responsibility still remains with the state. So the state, the government is still responsible that a certain service is delivered to the public. Take the example of kindergartens. Remember, the state is still responsible that kindergarten places are offered to the parents over a certain time frame of children, but it's only the ensuring responsibility. And last but not least, and that is of course the most important and most controversially discussed topic, usually it's called full privatization or material privatization. Material because, that is a real way of giving full responsibilities to the private sector. For instance, if, let's say, the state wants to get rid of, what could it be, telecommunication. The state will sell all its telecommunication properties. I have the feeling Italy did it with Telecom Italia. I'm not sure about that, but I think it was it sold to Vodafone or no, not Vodafone, no, to another international provider. I don't know the name. So if you really, apart from, let's say, some regulatory issues, you want to get rid of a certain service with all responsibilities, including the insuring responsibility, that is a case of material, full or real privatization. If we have some minutes left at the end of this session, I would like to discuss with you, let's say, some pros and cons of that idea. Just to, well, I think we skip it now because we want to discuss it later. No, you know, there are some pros and cons. We don't have to touch it at the moment. Maybe we come back to that. What are experiences with this variant of full privatization? If you look around in the world, in developing countries, but also in industrialized countries, we usually will find a mixed picture. I did some research in that field, and we found in our institute that, well, very roughly said about, let's say, 2/3 of privatization projects have been successful. That means at the end there is a positive result for the state and for the citizens. 1/3 have not been successful. There have been negative side effects, etc. I invite you to think a bit in about your own home countries, about, let's say, interesting privatization cases. If some of you are from the UK, you probably will know the railway privatization, one of the very exciting, controversially debated privatization in Great Britain. Nowadays, under debate whether it should be retransferred, at least to some extent, to the state, because at least some part of the privatization is not considered to have been successfully. So you see, there are some efficiency gains, but not necessarily. If cost savings, sometimes only in a short period, not on a longer term. Sometimes there is some, let's say, missing balance between economical terms on the one side and social or ecological effects on the other side. I would like to give you one example, water provision. If you privatize water provision in, let's say, in a developing country like India or Indonesia or Philippines, in municipal areas like Manila or Bombay or some of these real big important metropolitan areas, there might be a positive economic aspect. It might work, a privatized water provision might work more efficient, cost saving, more revenues. On the other side, it might be exclusive to low-income populations, because low-income people in certain areas are no more able to pay the charges for water provision, and then the private water company usually will just switch off the water pipeline, and then, of course, you will get some problems in that areas, in squatters or slums or something like that. So this type of problem should be observed if we discuss of privatization issues. What are frequently observed effects for the clients, for you? You are as citizens or consumers. In many cases, I just take the case of water privatization in the United Kingdom. One of the most visible effects was the nearly a duplication of the water charges for citizens. In UK, after privatization, the water charges have doubled when government privatized these services. Not at the moment, but in relatively short time of few years. So sometimes that's a maybe not really positive effect for citizens. I already mentioned marginal groups like low-income groups. There might be the risk that delivery stops if the private provider just goes for bankruptcy or something like that. There might be corruption problems. Well, but we know corruption problems are also in public sector. It's not only an issue of private sector provision. So I think we can conclude that debate at the moment. Maybe we come back in a few minutes on that if we have time. That the success of privatization is not only, or maybe not primarily, depending on the ownership issue. So it's not so important whether the owner of a certain capability of a certain institution is a public or a private owner. More important is the market and competitive regime of the respective service. So more important is that we regulate the delivery of the service in an effective way. We set the rules of the game so that there is no option for private providers just to exploit certain target groups or something like that. And there is a need always for social and also ecological countermeasures if we are privatizing. Sorry, I would like to move, but I'm bound here, so I hope next month it will be better. I think we are now entering more or less the last chart, and that gives us room for some debates in a minute. You remember I introduced about 30-40 minutes ago, there is a decrease of governmental or public influence if we go from autonomization to privatization. And there are also different variants of external steering modes. I think I can go a bit more faster through that. Just to give you an idea what is meant here, it's probably a bit too complicated for you, so therefore I don't put much emphasis on that. Government can use different modes of coordination and steering. They can do regulation by setting up some laws and legal principles. They can give hierarchical orders. They can steer in a hierarchy. They can formulate contracts with budgets with their contractors, or they can just set certain market incentives. Prices, for instance, are very important market incentives. So different variants are available for steering these different institutional and of course, sorry, I lost the last one. Also common values or a common ethos, like public sector ethos or something like that could be the solution. This little table finally gives you an understanding of what I tried to explain to you in the last hour. Well, of course, we had some more points and are covered in this table. If we look for the institutional option of autonomization, and please remember there are two different sub-options, agencies, corporations. If you opt for autonomization, the dominant steering mode of the government, which wants to still have control, will probably be hierarchy, to some extent also in modern context, contract management. If we try to assess the degree of influence of the government as the contractor on its own autonomous entities, on its own agencies and corporations, we can say, okay, it's +0. There is some influence, but the influence, and the influence is positive, so we have considerable influence, but it is somehow limited. If we move to the PPP solution, I think it won't surprise you very much that the influence of the government is decreasing. is just 0 because we have invited private capital, private co-owners or private companies to collaborate with us in a certain enterprise or in a certain project. Therefore, the government influence is less important. The private co-owner has its own shares and is taking influence. So let's receive plus, 0, only 0. One step forward, if we look for the contracting out issue, we will see that, oops, now I'm really blocking it here. You see it's 0 minus, that means in the contracting out issue we only can work with market incentives, maybe to some extent also with contracts. Now we set up a contract, we have clear agreements in that context on quantity, quality, etc. However, our influence is much lower because, well, of course it's depending a bit on the strictness of the contract, but usually it will be lower because we are dealing with a completely independent, different organization. The organization is no more part of government. It's just an autonomous third party with which we are undertaking a certain exercise. So the influence is pretty low, 0 minus, and even more restricted is, as you can see here, the last and most radical version, privatization in the sense of material, real privatization, not in the sense of only formal privatization. The influence of government is nearly nothing, or is nearly it's less than 0. It's minus, because apart from some regulation, government has no more opportunities. There is no ensuring responsibility. The whole task with all responsibility was transferred to the private sector, no influence anymore. So therefore, you see, we have to be aware if we want to, now last point of the day, apart from our small last discussions, if we want to decide, well, what is the best solution? Institutional solution. Core government, autonomous organization, PPP, private for-profit company, private non-for-profit organization. We have to realize it's always balancing on the one side. No, there's no single clear answer. We always have to balance on the one side flexibility, freedom to manage, giving more autonomy. On the other side, a loss of influence and of control by the government. And that is, well, it sounds maybe pretty simple for you, but if you look into practice, it's one of the big issues of nowadays politics to balance or to come to solutions on this issue. Well, at the end, please take notice what you already know more or less from the syllabus. There is one obligational reading, that is the text, my own text in this case, on institutional arrangements in the reader, and there are some more suggested, additional, of course, optional readings with which you might deal. Wait a second, please. Please be patient for a few minutes.